Hello, friends, and welcome back to r/ProRevenge. In our first story, you'll learn what happens when boss treats employees like crap. When he needs them, they'll watch him burn. Our first story. Boss wouldn't let me switch shifts with someone who owed me. I work at a very popular restaurant that sells a lot in a single day. We have the same system where you get your schedule, and usually that's it, but sometimes people need shift changes. Before, we were able to switch shifts as long as you found somebody to switch with or cover you as long as they didn't hit overtime. Until recently, my boss decided that we could no longer switch shifts or get covers unless you were sick, which you also needed a doctor's note. Of course, this policy fell apart quickly, and the boss had to start letting a few people switch. A week ago, I covered for a coworker, a fellow cook. I don't know the reason, as I didn't ask, nor did I care. More money for me, right? He gets permission from the boss, so I cover him no problems. But this week, I wanted to go to a party at night, but the next morning I had to work early in the morning. This sucks. So I talked to the person who I covered and asked him if he would be okay switching. He didn't mind since I covered for him. Besides, we worked the same day, he just worked a couple hours later. There also wouldn't be an overtime problem since the shifts were both the same time. When I ask my manager if it's okay, he tells me that it doesn't matter to him if I want to go to a party, that if it was important to me, I would have let him know so he could give me the day. I try to tell him that the person is okay with it, and either way, he owed me the favor. He still said no, even though it was really not a big deal, like at all. He just didn't want to let me change. This pissed me off a lot, since I would always stay anywhere from 3 to 9 hours extra on my original shift on occasions where someone else either didn't show up at all or had a last-minute call-in. I'd done this several times and knew this would be the way to get my revenge. Next time someone didn't show up for the closing shift on a busy day for us is like $12K a day, he asked me if I could stay and close. I let him know that I can't. When he asked why, I told him the same thing he told me. It didn't matter to me if someone else didn't show up. He got mad and walked away. I promptly left at the time that it said in my schedule that I should leave. I heard from other coworkers that it was super busy and that the manager wasn't able to cook fast enough to satisfy the demand. We had a lot of complaints, which go onto the manager's record as well as the store's. And our second story. Just replace the fuel pump. Many moons ago, thankfully, I was employed by an automotive repair/parts chain represented by 3 cheery adolescents. It was my second stint with this particular company, and this time around I was the assistant service manager at our location. A little backstory about me. I'm a car guy. Always have been, always will be. I've been turning wrenches as long as I could, ogling cars in parking lots since forever. I attended a very good local community college automotive technology program, got my ASE certificates, and in the time before this story, I worked as a professional technician, a parts guy, and even had a brief stint in the performance aftermarket. For all intents and purposes, and for lack of a better term, I know my crap. The fun thing in dealing with retail, independent as opposed to manufacturer-run like a dealership auto repair shop, is that you truly get all kinds. But ask anybody in automotive repair, and they'll pretty much confirm that know-it-alls are the absolute worst. See, when you have a clueless customer, they generally know they're clueless. And when you have a properly informed customer, they generally know they're well-informed. Both of them are just fine to deal with, typically. And most people can understand and respect the knowledge and expertise that professionals have. But the know-it-all? There's something about the way their brain fires that means they just have to be right. Doesn't matter if they're wrong or not. Enter customer A. We'll call him John because, frankly, I don't effing remember what his name actually was. John drove a mid-2000s Chevy Silverado. Gold, 2-door, short bed, pretty typical practical truck by all accounts, and anybody familiar with GM trucks knows they're generally pretty straightforward when it comes to repairs. John had his truck towed in because it wasn't running. I was working the counter because one of my CSAs called in sick. I didn't mind working the counter as it kept me busy and made the day go by faster. So John comes in and tells me the truck isn't running. He wants to replace the fuel pump because that's the problem. I go into my pitch and explain to John that we'd like to start off with an actual diagnostic, which is $90, but that if they opt to get the vehicle fixed on that visit, we'll waive the $90. The nice thing about doing it that way is that if we diagnose the vehicle incorrectly, it's on us, and I would make it a point to make it right. But I was also blessed to have a pretty damn solid master tech in my shop who was great at his diags. So I explained that, hey, if we start with the diag, find out it's the fuel pump, and replace the fuel pump, it's literally the same price. But if we start with the diag and find out it's not the fuel pump, then we can tell him and fix the actual issue. Just replace the fuel pump. John is insistent that the fuel pump is at fault. I write up the estimate to the tune of about $600 and John signs off. I explain that since he didn't ask us to do the diagnosis, even if the fuel pump doesn't solve the issue, he's going to pay for the job in full. John says, fine, just do it. Okay. Tech pulls the truck in, takes the bed off, swaps out the fuel pump, and gets it all back together. A few hours later, lo and behold, the truck doesn't start. I call up John and explain the situation, then again ask him if he wants us to actually diagnose it. Now he authorizes the diag. My tech takes a look at it and finds out that the powertrain control module has a fault. I call John back and get authorization to fix it, to the tune of another $600. We waive the $90 diagnostic, of course, order up a new PCM, get it programmed, and a few hours later, the truck runs. When John returns to pay for it, grumbling about the $1,200 price tag, I remind him that he had the opportunity to have us diagnose it at the start, and he wouldn't have had to pay for the fuel pump replacement. John was displeased with that. And our last story. Nepotism won't save you here. My wife is a software engineer, SWE, at a mid-sized tech company. Recently, her team got a new member, and from day one, it was clear he didn't really belong. We'll call him Junior, or JR. On paper, JR did not meet the usual requirements of most candidates, but it turns out that the CTO, Chief Technology Officer, was this guy's relative. JR went through the process for a JR SWE for new grads, and he performed well. Not the best, but not that bad. So they hired him, fearing retribution from the CTO. Whenever people are added onto the team, there's a bit of a learning curve to get used to the process and the level of performance the team expects from all SWE. For the average new SWE, it takes about 3 months to acclimate, depending on your experience. After 3 months, you should need little to no handholding and contribute to the team. My wife was in charge of his training, being a senior SWE on the team. Throughout his training, he made comments like, "Wow, you're pretty smart for a girl engineer," and "Did you write this or did a guy write this?" referring to code. This wasn't the first time she'd heard this, but reminded JR that his comments are insensitive and that women SWEs are no different than male ones. She reminded him many times, and every time he'd just laugh it off and say, "I'm just kidding, don't be so sensitive." One more thing about him. At least a quarter of the 1,000 engineers at the company were Middle Eastern, including the person leading my wife's team. JR would make comments about how he hated walking over to certain areas because it smelled like curry too much. Her boss eventually told JR to stop and that this behavior and comments like that will not be tolerated. Normally, fools like this would be fired, but since the CTO was JR's relative, we had to give him a second chance. For about a month, he seemed to get it and improved. Then came the company holiday party, and this guy just let it out like a faucet. During the party, I attended with my wife, and this guy was drunk before he got there. Not a little drunk, but very drunk. He starts getting more shots when someone from HR goes up to JR to tell him to stop and that he needs to go home. JR tells HR person to F off. Wife's boss then steps in and brings him to a corner, and then out of nowhere, we all hear JR scream, "Eat crap, you R-head!" That silenced the room, and my wife decided to step in, being the person who knows him best. She drags JR out of the venue while screaming obscenities. Some people and I walk out to see if my wife needs help, and we see this little crap trying to touch my wife. I almost do something until I see my wife backhand him across the face with her ring hand. It cuts his face, and blood is flowing down. A few guys restrain him, and my wife walks back to me with a huge grin on her face and says, "Let's party." At this point, it's obvious the kid is gone. CTO can't do jack about it since 1,000 people witnessed the shenanigans, and it was all on security cameras as well. After the party, Monday morning, JR is escorted out by 2 security guards. Over the next few weeks, my wife has to go through his laptop and start divvying out his duties. Instead of just divvying out tasks, my wife decides to dig deeper into what he was doing at his desk the whole time because his code sucked, and he was always late with finishing projects. It doesn't take long for my wife to find out JR was copying code to a USB drive, huge no-no. She also discovers that he was using company time and materials to code his own projects that he was doing with his friends. My wife brings this up to her boss and in turn to the head of the department. This quickly becomes a legal issue as the company needs to know where the copied code ended up, and taking code is basically stealing. Also, whatever you do on company property belongs to the company. So not only does this guy lose his job, he's eventually sued by my wife's company for stealing code, and the projects he was working on with his friends now belong to the company, therefore screwing over the friends he'd partnered with. On the day of the first and last hearing between both parties and the judge, my wife's company didn't even send an attorney. They sent the legal assistant with all the contracts, the reported incidences, and video evidence. The judge takes about 10 minutes looking over the evidence and immediately throws out the suit. JR complains, and the judge says that he's basically doing JR a favor because if he lets this suit continue, he'll lose and the company can countersue for billed legal fees, which could be anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000. Last my wife heard from the CTO, JR had been virtually kicked out of the family for his behavior and embarrassing CTO. My wife got all this info from CTO. After the incident, we all became good friends. I even golf with this guy a few times a month. Good dude. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.